All right, we're gonna build this engine. I'm gonna walk you through it and show you what we're doing with it. That's gonna be cool. But obviously my table's a mess from the work. So I need to clean this off real quick. So just give me a second, hold up. All right, a little bit of video magic and boom, there we are. Okay, check it out. These are the things that we're gonna talk about in a minute. But I wanted to get started on this. So this is the engine that we're building. This is the Shortblock assembly, it's already done. So let's talk about what's going on. This is a 4.6 Ford. Most of my stuff is Mustang stuff, but a lot of this applies across the board to a lot of different engines. And so, let's take a look at this bad boy. Let me maybe adjust a little bit. Okay, so 4.6 Ford. It's kind of sitting at top dead center right now. So this is cylinder 1 on Ford. Now, so we modified this engine for boost, and let's talk about what that means. Let me actually grab something real quick so I can show y'all what I'm talking about. It's not a very broken one. I want a very broken one. There we go. That's a very broken one. All right, so I briefly touch on this with the piston video I have. If you want more details on it, you can go on that. But what do you change when you're doing a turbo or boost build? This is gonna be supercharged from the original naturally aspirated motor. A lot of turbo engines are already kind of designed for the extra boost and heat that it creates. But on a naturally aspirated motor, there's a lot of different things to change. So we'll start with the first thing I make a change on is the rings, so the piston rings themselves. And the reason being is because when the ring gets too hot because of the extra boost, the ring collapses. So you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a space between the rings, the ring gap, and that collapses. And then once that seizes, it does this. So you end up in a situation where it snaps the ring lands, and then you lose compression on that piston. You end up with a lot of blow-by, and sometimes if it snaps the top of the piston off, you end up with this condition where it's just completely screwed. And then you ruin the heads and everything else too. So these are 2 pistons that are factory pistons from a Ford, and both of these were boosted cars, and both of these had the same failure. This is the #1 failure I see with the naturally aspirated Mustangs and people building boost on the 4.6. And that's why a lot of people have problems with the 4.6. They're always telling you to go Coyote because they survive. Well, those are the reasons that they survive. I, however, like to build a 4.6 because I like building engines. It's fun to re-engineer it, it's fun to design it and set it up, so it's really cool. So let's take, yeah, but I'm using this to make sure I get the shot correct, so you guys, I can make sure y'all can see. The pistons are 4340 pistons, a little bit stronger than factory. Again, my piston video goes into the details of those. But what we did with this block is we cut the rings a little bit bigger. So the ring cut usually is, I think like it's 0.18 or 0.19 for the factory, and I went to a I'm sorry, not 0.18, 0.018. I went to a 0.025. Pretty much, 2.5, 2.6, somewhere in there. So opened up the ring gaps a little bit. You do lose a little bit of compression efficiency, but you make up for that by being able to add the boost and everything. And to be honest with you, the amount of compression efficiency that you lose off of that is so minimal. Now, if you cut these rings up to like 0.050, you're gonna end up with a whole bunch of blow-by, and you're gonna have a bunch of oil consumption issues and stuff like that. A lot of people, when they build an engine, they'll put it together, and if they have oil coming out of the, or smoke coming out of the exhaust, they're like, oh, the rings need to set before it will work out, and it'll smooth out later. That never happens. An engine should run pretty much how it's going to run as soon as you fire it up. It doesn't take much for the rings to set. There's a break-in period. I'm not going to get into what I feel about that stuff because there's a lot of different ideas and things. So anyway, 4340 pistons, stronger than stock. We did opened up the ring gaps a little bit. Now we're going to go to the bottom end here. So if we take a look at the bottom end, pretty standard. So we got the forged Cobra crank in it. Cobra crank comes stock in this thing. This is a 97 Taksid block. It's a very good block. The Ford Cobra crank is just fine for it. It works perfectly well. So that covers all of our power requirements there. And then I use the factory Ford main studs, which is fine. It didn't have to go to I didn't go to main studs. I used the factory bolts just because I'm not going to push enough in this car to need studs. Thing is, if you do use studs, it does change the bore on each of the main caps, so you do have to do a line hone if you change the studs. So you got to remember, every time you make a change on a motor or anything like that, the first change ends up compounding into a bunch of other changes. So that ends up compounding into a bunch of money you're about to spend. So it's good to know where you're going to be right out the gate, because you don't want to miss or skip steps because things started to get too expensive. That's how you end up with failure. So this is a balanced rotating assembly to this crankshaft. So you can see the crank's been drilled to match the counterweights to the rotating assembly, and then the rods and pistons have all been shaved in a way that balances everything together. So this bottom end is in really good shape. The other thing I like to do when we're putting a race engine together, and we're going to talk about doing higher boost levels, lots of cylinder pressure. So you got to think, if you're pumping a bunch of cylinder pressure into here and you're pressing down on that piston really hard, it's pressing all that pressure against the rod. And what is that rod? What's in the inside of that rod is a journal bearing, and the journal bearing is where the oil flows. So basically the way it's going to work is, I'm not going to explain how journal bearings work because that's not what this video is really about. But long story short, go look up what a journal bearing, how it works, blah, blah, blah. There's a film of oil between the outer or inner diameter of the rod and the outer diameter of the crankshaft, and vice versa on the main caps. And that thin layer of oil is what the rod floats in, Now, the factory engine has a really tight tolerance there, and it uses a thinner oil. So the tighter the tolerance, the thinner the oil you can use or should use. The wider the tolerance, the thicker the oil needs to be to help maintain that space between the rod and the crankshaft. When you're adding extra cylinder pressure and pressing down harder on the rod, you're asking that oil to keep that rod from touching the crankshaft, right? So this is the crankshaft, this is the rod around it, and it's pressing down. There should be a little bit of space. If you press down too hard, it'll squeeze the oil out of it, and your rod actually makes contact with the crank, and then you end up with a spot on the bearing that gets touched. And if you do it too much and too hard, it'll spin the bearing. So we're trying to avoid that, and the way we do that is I'm actually running a set of King race bearings, which are slightly larger than stock space-wise. So we're actually going to run a 15W50 oil in this motor so that it stays very, very thick and gives me a nice large cushion to have these rods pressing into. And then so our factory clearances for the rods and everything I got written down, we're all pretty much .0030. We have a 0035, 004, which is kind of wide, but I'm not really concerned about it because we are running that thick oil. So everything pretty much was between, where we needed to be. So 0030 was the main shot for all the journal bearings through the bottom end of the motor. And then, so now we've covered the pistons and the bearing assembly and how the rotating assembly is designed. So that's pretty much the short block. Now that we're asking it to do a lot of extra oil pressure and oil thickness, we're asking, it's going to be a lot more work for this engine to maintain oil going through it. So we added a billet oil pump from Boundary. So Boundary, it's a 3-valve pump which works on the 4.6, and it's so the 3 valves are bigger. So it's basically like doing a 4.6 with a ported pump, and it's got a billet gear in here, and then 60-pound spring for the oil pressure. So we're going to be running 60 pounds of oil pressure with pretty thick oil. And I've got my MMR crank gear here. There's a lot of people that complain and argue about MMR. I get it, guys. If it fails, it fails. So we'll keep an eye on that. This is a big science project for us all. So if we fail on our MMR crank gear, we'll all know it. Okay. So that's pretty much the short block. That's what we got floating around right here. It's in really good shape. I'm excited about it. I think it's a good build. Okay.